My name's Jeremy Myers. This happened back in late September of 2013. I was 34 years old at the time and had just transferred to a quieter post up in northern Washington, a few miles south of the Canadian border. After nearly a decade of working at busier national parks down in Utah and Arizona, I figured I'd take a seasonal gig up in a place called McLeod Ridge. It was a lesser-known state forest, about 80,000 acres of thick trees, steep hills, and old service trails that barely anyone used anymore. The idea was to get away from the crowds, spend more time patrolling solo, and enjoy some peace and quiet before winter kicked in. They assigned me a small ranger station that sat off an old gravel road, tucked in about 12 miles from the nearest paved highway. The place wasn't anything fancy. A single-story wooden cabin with a covered porch, one bedroom, a desk with an old radio, and a kitchen that still had appliances from the late 80s. The only thing modern was the generator out back and a solar array that barely gave enough power to keep the lights and fridge going. There was no cell reception, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. The ranger I was relieving, a guy named Doug who had worked that stretch for over 20 years, gave me a quick run-through before he left. He warned me that most of the old trails in the northern part of the forest weren't mapped anymore. He said they used to be used for fire patrols or maintenance back in the day, but budget cuts shut those operations down. He also told me that if I heard anything strange in the woods at night, I should just stay inside and wait for it to pass. I assumed he meant animals, maybe bears or coyotes. He didn't elaborate and I didn't push. I chalked it up to local ranger superstition and shrugged it off. My first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days checking campsites, logging tree fall, watching for signs of poaching, and making notes about trail damage. It was calm work. The weather was decent. Some foggy mornings, some light rain, but nothing I couldn't handle. The woods up there were beautiful too. Dense evergreens, deep ravines, and little creeks that cut through the terrain like veins. It felt untouched, quiet in a way that you don't really get down in the lower parks anymore. About 3 weeks into my post, I started getting interference on the radio during the night. It only happened between midnight and 2 a.m., and it always came in the form of short bursts, static, a click, then silence. At first, I thought maybe the tower was picking up bleed-through from weather stations or aircraft, but the signal was too weak for that. There was no talking, no alerts, just the kind of noise that makes you lean forward and listen, thinking something is about to come through but never does. I mentioned it to the local station back in Colville, but they didn't think much of it. Said the equipment out there was old and probably picking up signal drift from a nearby installation. But I knew better. This wasn't some random glitch. It happened at the same time every night, and it always ended with a single loud pop, like someone pressing a button or tapping the microphone. After that, the line would go dead again. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but it started getting to me. Then, on October 4th, I went out to check an old trail system on the north side of the park, something marked as Ridgeway 6 on the laminated map pinned in the cabin. It hadn't been maintained in at least a decade, overgrown with saplings and fallen limbs. I had to park my truck about a quarter mile up and hike the rest of the way in on foot. After about an hour of cutting through brush and deadfall, I came across something I wasn't expecting. It looked like an old logging shack, smaller than my cabin, barely big enough to stand in. The wood siding was rotten and the roof sagged, but the door was intact. There were no signs that anyone had been there recently. No footprints, no trash, nothing. But what threw me off was that the ground around the shack looked cleared. Not cleaned exactly, but swept, like someone had come through and pushed the leaves and sticks away in a neat little circle. Out of curiosity, I stepped inside. The shack was empty, just a dirt floor and a couple of rusted cans in the corner. But there were fresh marks in the dust, boot prints, and they weren't mine. I could tell from the pattern and the spacing that someone had been there recently, within the last couple of days. That trail had no official maintenance, no active campgrounds, no reason for anyone to be out there. I backed out and radioed it in, but the call didn't go through. I hiked back to the truck and tried again, but still nothing. The radio was completely dead, which made no sense. It had been working that morning when I checked in. I drove back to the cabin and tried from the base unit, but all I got was a weak hum, followed by silence. Not even static, like someone had pulled the plug. I ran a full check on the power system. The solar bank was fine, the generator was fine, everything was operational. But the radio wouldn't work, not even on battery backup. That night, the interference came back. This time it didn't come through the radio, it came through the walls. I know how that sounds, but I was sitting at the kitchen table around 1 a.m. writing my report when I heard a short thump against the outside wall. Then another, and another, not loud, just enough to make you stop what you're doing and listen. It wasn't woodpeckers, it wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. The taps were spaced out and hit in the same pattern, 3 in a row, pause, then 2 more, then silence. I sat there for probably 10 minutes without moving. Then I grabbed the flashlight, loaded my sidearm, and stepped out on the porch. Nothing. The air was still. The forest was silent. Even the crickets had stopped. I swept the area with my light but saw no movement. No tracks in the dirt. No eyes watching from the trees. The next morning, I walked the perimeter and checked for signs. Broken branches, disturbed soil, any indication that something had come through. I didn't find anything. That was the day I stopped sleeping through the night. Every hour or so I'd wake up, listen, and check the window. I started keeping my boots on when I laid down, just in case I had to leave quickly. I kept the truck keys in my pocket and left the shotgun by the front door. A few nights later, something changed. I was up around 2 a.m. again, sitting at the desk with a thermos of coffee, trying to write out a detailed report about the shack and the radio failure. That's when I saw movement through the front window, just a flicker of something crossing the clearing about 20 feet away. I turned off the lantern and stood there in the dark for a full minute, eyes locked on the glass. It was a person. Whoever it was, they were tall, thin, and wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see the face, but I could see their shape move from left to right just beyond the edge of the tree line. No flashlight, no sound, just slow, deliberate movement. I didn't go out. I didn't call it in. The radio still wasn't working. I just stood there, frozen, until the figure disappeared into the trees. Then I sat in the dark until sunrise. The next morning, I packed my gear and hiked back to that shack. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe signs of a camp or food wrappers or tracks. But what I found was worse. There was a message carved into the door. It wasn't there the first time I saw it. I would have noticed. It was deep, fresh, and done with a knife. It said, "You stay, I stay." I backed away slowly, heart pounding, and hiked straight back to the truck. I tried the radio again. Still nothing. I drove to the service tower out on Route 12, about 30 minutes away, and climbed up to get a signal. I finally reached Colville and reported what I'd seen and found. They told me to stay calm, document everything, and wait for a response team to arrive the next morning. That night, I locked every door and window, turned off all the lights, and sat on the floor with my back to the wall. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. This time it was on the back wall, the side with no windows. I held my breath. I didn't move, didn't look. I just waited. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy. Pause. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It didn't shake. Turned smoothly, like someone was testing it. The door was locked, thank God. But the silence that followed was worse. Whoever it was, they just stood there. I stayed like that until dawn. When the sun rose, I stepped outside with the gun raised. Nothing. No tracks. No signs. Just the cold morning air and the distant sound of birds coming back to life. The team from Colville arrived around 10 a.m. I walked them through everything, showed them the radio, the shack, the door carving. They took photos, logged the incident, and told me I could take a few days off if I wanted. I didn't go back. I didn't finish the season. I resigned 2 weeks later and moved back down to Spokane. Took a job at a local wildlife center and haven't been out to a remote post since. I still think about that shack, about those knocks, about the message on the door. You stay, I stay. That wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was late November of 2014 when I drove up to an old hunting cabin in north central Michigan, not far from Gladwin County. I was 35 back then, working a desk job in Detroit. Life had been heavy that year. A bad breakup, long hours at work, and the city noise had all worn me down. I needed a break from everything. I didn't want people, phones, or even music. Just silence, trees, and cold air. I had been to this cabin twice before, once with my uncle years ago when I was in college and once with a friend, but this time I was going alone. My uncle used to lease the land back in the early 2000s, but when he passed, nobody in the family touched the place. I wasn't even sure if it was still standing, but I took a gamble and brought all my gear anyway: rifle, food, warm clothes, propane heater, the works. It was hunting season, and I figured even if the place was falling apart, I could sleep in my truck or pitch a tent. The drive took about 4 hours. After passing the small town of Beaverton, I veered off the main road onto a dirt trail that looked like it hadn't seen a tire in years. Thick pine trees surrounded everything, and the mud was frozen just enough that I didn't get stuck. I drove in slow, keeping my eyes peeled for deer signs or other hunters, but it was empty out there. Eventually, after about 20 minutes crawling along the trail, I reached the clearing, and there it was, the cabin, still standing, weathered and gray, with patches of moss on the walls and broken shingles littering the dirt around it. But it was intact. The small chimney looked like it hadn't been used in a decade, and one of the side windows had a crack running across it. The front porch sagged a little, but the door was closed and still had the rusty lock I remembered. I parked my truck next to the clearing and stepped out. Cold air slapped my face, and I breathed it in. It was the first time in months that I felt something close to peace.
No voices, no sirens.
Just whined through the trees. I unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first: old wood, dust, and mold, but it wasn't too bad. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. 2 bunks on one side, a little table, and a propane stove in the corner. There were cobwebs in the rafters, dead bugs in the sink, and mouse droppings on the floor, but nothing that couldn't be swept out. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning up, setting traps for any critters, and making the place livable. That night, I sat outside in a folding chair by a small fire I made with dead wood. The stars above were bright, and I heard owls hooting far off in the distance. I ate some chinchilli, sipped from my flask, and felt more human than I had in a long time. The first day of hunting went quietly. I set out before sunrise with my rifle, wearing full camo and orange gear. I followed a game trail northeast of the cabin where I remembered seeing deer sign years ago. I moved slow, scanning for movement, keeping my ears open. Around noon, I saw a buck maybe 200 yards away, but he was already running by the time I got the scope on him. Other than that, nothing. I came back to the cabin late afternoon, tired and cold. I cooked a small dinner, sat by the fire again, and then went inside and lit the propane heater. I fell asleep early, wrapped in 2 layers of sleeping bags. The second day was colder. There was a light snow falling by the time I woke up, and I noticed tracks around the back of the cabin. Deer prints. They went right behind the building and disappeared into the woods. I followed them that morning, hoping to get lucky. They led me farther east than I expected, past some thick brush, over a shallow frozen creek, and through an old logging trail that hadn't been used in years. By early afternoon, I realized I was farther from the cabin than I wanted to be. I hadn't seen a single deer, and now I wasn't sure how long it would take to get back. I turned around and retraced my steps, but as I moved through the trees, I noticed something strange. There were fresh boot prints in the snow that weren't mine. They came from the south and crossed over my tracks from earlier. Big, heavy prints like someone wearing thick winter boots. I stood there a long time just looking at them. They hadn't been there when I came through that morning. Whoever made them had to have passed through maybe an hour or so ago. I followed them with my eyes. They moved west, heading toward the general direction of the cabin. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. I didn't see anyone out here. I hadn't heard a single sound that whole day. It was too quiet for someone to be walking that close without me noticing. I crouched down and studied the tracks. They were deep, steady, and spaced out. Whoever it was walked like they knew where they were going. I thought maybe it was just another hunter, but something about it didn't sit right. I stood up, checked my rifle, and started walking fast back toward the cabin. I got back around dusk. I didn't see anyone on the way, and the tracks eventually veered off and disappeared near a patch of thick undergrowth. When I reached the clearing, I stood at the edge for a minute and just watched. The cabin looked untouched. My truck was still there. No signs of movement, but I didn't go straight in. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking every side. That's when I saw the door. It was open, only a few inches, but I had locked it that morning before leaving. I always made sure. It didn't blow open either. The lock was dangling, still snapped in place, but the latch had been unscrewed from the wall. 2 screws lying on the porch. I didn't go in right away. I stayed outside, my rifle in hand, heart thudding in my ears. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then I finally stepped inside. The inside looked the same, mostly, but I noticed little things. The chair at the table was pulled out. The can of beans I left on the counter was gone. One of the blankets from the lower bunk was on the floor. I backed out and shut the door behind me, locking it from the inside. I didn't eat that night. I sat by the fire with my back to the wall and rifle on my lap. I didn't sleep much either. Next morning, I checked around the cabin again. Fresh boot prints circled the entire clearing. Not mine. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night. Just walking. That day I stayed close. I didn't hunt. I wanted to pack up and leave, but something in me said no. I was angry more than scared. I didn't like the idea of being pushed out. Maybe it was just a local messing with me. Maybe someone saw my truck and decided to screw around. But something about the whole thing felt different. It didn't feel like a prank. That evening, I hiked a short distance out and set up a small trail cam I had in my gear. Just a cheap motion sensor one, but it would do. I placed it low near the base of a tree, facing the front of the cabin. I wanted to see if anyone came around again. I went to bed early, but didn't really sleep. Every sound outside made my eyes snap open. Around 3 a.m., I heard faint crunching in the snow. I held my breath and stayed still. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and steady. I didn't dare peek out the window. After a while, it went quiet again. At sunrise, I stepped outside, rifle ready. Fresh prints again. Same kind. They went around the cabin once and vanished toward the woods. I pulled the SD card from the trail cam and plugged it into my laptop inside. There were 3 shots. The first one was from mid-afternoon, me walking back from the creek. The second was just after sunset. Nothing but trees and snow. A small rabbit hopped by. The third was at 3:11 a.m. A man standing just at the edge of the trees, wearing a dark coat, hood up. He was facing the cabin, not moving, just standing there. He wasn't holding a gun, just staring. My blood went cold. I zoomed in, but the image was blurry. couldn't see his face, but the shape of him. He was big, tall, broad shoulders, and he had something hanging from his belt. Looked like a hatchet. I packed up within an hour. I didn't take time to clean up. Threw everything in the truck and got out fast. Drove without stopping until I hit the paved road. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Back home, I didn't tell anyone much, just that the trip didn't go well. I didn't even look at the trail cam again. Threw it in a drawer. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I thought about telling the sheriff's office out there, but what would I say? A guy stood outside my cabin in the woods? Years have passed. I still hunt, but never alone. Never that deep, and never in that part of Michigan again. The weirdest part? That trail cam I used only records 30 seconds per trigger. But the last shot of that man, he never moved, just stood there the whole time, like he knew exactly how long it would run. And that still bothers me. It was 2021 when I took the trip. I had just turned 36, and after months of working overtime and barely sleeping, I told my boss I was taking a full week off, no matter what. I didn't care if it was paid or not. I wanted silence. I needed it. I live in Mesa, Arizona, but I've always been more comfortable around open land than cities. My dad raised me on hunting trips near the New Mexico border, and growing up, most of our free time was spent camping, driving old dirt roads, tracking elk in the high desert, or hiking the red rocks near Sedona. So when I got online looking for a place to stay, I ignored all the fancy mountain resorts and rental cabins near tourist towns. I was looking for something different, something quiet, isolated, and maybe even uncomfortable. I found an old listing on a website called Canyon Getaways. It looked like a place people didn't rent often. There were only 3 photos, one of the cabin's front porch, one of a dusty dirt trail leading away from it, and one of a broken-down windmill a few hundred yards out in the brush. No reviews, no description, just a GPS coordinate and a phone number to call. The price was dirt cheap, $75 for 7 nights. That should have raised a red flag, but it didn't. I called the number. A man answered with a dry, raspy voice. Didn't say his name. He didn't ask for mine either. He just asked how long I wanted the place and what days. I told him. He asked for my Venmo and sent a request. That was it. No deposit, no contract, no nothing. Just coordinates and a time to arrive. I knew it was weird, but I didn't care. I figured it was just some old-timer with land to spare who didn't care about rules or taxes. I packed light. A few changes of clothes, my old .30-06 bolt-action rifle, a cooler full of dry food and water, some freeze-dried meals, a first aid kit, my boots, my sleeping bag, and a single-burner propane stove. I charged my phone, downloaded some offline maps, and printed out the GPS coordinates in case I lost signal. I had no plans to go into town or talk to anyone, just a week of peace. The cabin was about 4 hours east of Mesa, somewhere between Show Low and the White Mountains. The last hour of driving was just dirt road, narrow, winding, surrounded by brush and dry pine. My Tacoma handled it fine, though I had to slow down in a few spots where the road dipped into arroyos or got washed out. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised by how small it was. It looked even older than in the pictures, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, made of dry gray logs, with a tin roof that had rusted around the edges. There was no fence, no neighbors, not even a driveway, just a clearing in the brush where someone had parked before. The front steps were cracked and uneven, and the wooden door had no lock, just a heavy metal latch you could fasten from the inside. I stood outside for a while just listening. No sounds but the wind in the trees and the creak of the old windmill a few hundred yards out. Inside, the cabin had only the basics. One wooden table, a single chair, a cot in the corner with a thin mattress on it, a small stove, and a shelf with some old canned goods. No power,
No plumbing.
no signal. Smelled like dry wood and dust, but nothing foul. I aired it out, swept the floor with a broken broom I found behind the door, and set my stuff down. It wasn't cozy, but I wasn't looking for cozy. That first day passed slow. I took a short hike out to the west side of the ridge to get a view of the valley below. You could see forever. Nothing but low hills, brush, and sky. No roads, no buildings. It was perfect. When I got back, I made a simple meal on the burner, cleaned my rifle, and read a book until the sun dipped low behind the trees. The nights came fast out there. By 8 p.m., it was pitch black. I lay on the cot in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind and the creak of that old windmill. Felt good to be alone again.
No buzzing phones. No emails. No lights.
I slept hard. The second day I went further out, followed a dry wash that ran north of the cabin and looked for signs of game. Found some old mule deer tracks and scat, and a small pile of bones that looked like a fox or a coyote had been at work. Nothing strange, but that night something felt different. I heard footsteps just after midnight. They were light, irregular, too light for a human, too clumsy for a deer. They circled the cabin once, then again, then stopped. I didn't move. I lay there with my rifle across my chest, staring at the ceiling. I waited at least an hour before I finally sat up and peeked through a crack in the wall, but saw nothing. Just darkness and wind. In the morning, I found prints around the cabin. They weren't clean, more like smudges in the dry dirt. They looked like bare feet, but the toes were wrong, spread out too wide and long. I told myself it was just a raccoon or something bigger, maybe a black bear with a bad paw. Still, I kept my rifle close the rest of the day. That evening, I climbed up the ridge to the west again and watched the sunset from a boulder that looked over the valley. As the sky turned pink and orange, I heard something below me, maybe 100 yards off. It sounded like someone coughing, but it wasn't a normal cough. It was dry, slow, too spaced out. I froze and scanned the brush. Nothing moved. I waited half an hour before heading back down. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern lit until it ran out of propane, then just sat in the dark listening. The windmill creaked, but the wind was calm. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching at the back wall. Not loud, just a slow dragging sound, like claws or nails on wood. I sat up and waited, holding my rifle. The sound stopped, then footsteps again circling, then silence. In the morning, more tracks, some barefoot, some like animal prints, but the sizes didn't match. One looked like a big paw, the other looked like a hand. I didn't know what to make of it. I started to get this tight feeling in my chest, like someone was watching me. It wouldn't go away, even in the daylight. I tried to hike further out, thinking maybe the cabin was making me paranoid. But the further I went, the more I felt like someone was just behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling stayed. That night, I set up a little tripwire out of fishing line and tied an old tin can to it. I strung it across the front steps and set some glass bottles on the porch railing, just enough to make noise if anything came close. At 3:17 a.m., the can dropped. I bolted upright and shouldered my rifle. I didn't make a sound. I listened. Something stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked. Then it got quiet. I aimed at the door, waiting for a shadow or a hand or anything. Nothing. I waited like that for nearly 2 hours. When I finally opened the door at sunrise, everything looked normal. But the can was on the ground and the bottles were gone. I found 2 of them later, smashed near the windmill. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed everything up and loaded the truck, but when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Battery was fine. Fuel was fine, but it just cranked and cranked. I opened the hood and found the wires to the distributor had been pulled. Not cut, pulled. frayed like someone had yanked them with their hands. I felt sick. Someone had been under the hood. That meant they'd been close, watching. I took the rifle and hiked 2 miles toward the road, thinking I might get signal. I got one bar near a dead tree on the ridge and sent my brother a message with my location. Then I waited. No reply. By the time I got back to the cabin, the door was open. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been moved. My clothes were spread out on the floor. My sleeping bag was unzipped and laid flat. The chair had been turned to face the wall. And on the table, someone had left something I didn't own. A dead bird. Its neck was broken clean, and its wings were spread like it had been posed. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner with my rifle and waited. I thought I saw movement outside a few times. A figure ducking behind trees, something crawling near the brush, but I couldn't be sure. My flashlight was dead. My phone was dead. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Just before sunrise, I heard breathing at the window. Slow, heavy, like someone with a deep chest cold. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing stayed for at least 5 minutes. Then it stopped. When the sun came up, I ran. I took what I could carry and didn't look back. I hiked 8 miles west before a rancher found me walking along an old fence line. He gave me water and a ride into town. I didn't say much, just that my truck broke down and I needed to get home. I never went back for the truck. I reported it stolen later that week and paid the fine. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a sheriff's office out near Apache County. They found the truck, abandoned, doors open, everything gone. But on the inside of the windshield, someone had scratched words into the glass with what looked like a rock. "You saw me." I never told them what happened. I just said I didn't want the truck back. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't use words like skinwalker or shapeshifter. I think it was a man who lived out there maybe for years, someone who studied animals, someone who knew how to move like them, sound like them, someone who liked scaring people more than hurting them. But he could have hurt me, easily. He didn't. That's what I think about the most. He didn't, but he wanted me to know he could have. And that's why I'll never go back. I wasn't always the kind of person to go out alone for weekends in the countryside. That came after the move. I had been living in Exeter for nearly 3 years by 2016, working as a logistics coordinator for a small import-export company. My job was fine, though mostly remote by then. It was the quiet that got to me sometimes. My girlfriend and I had split up the year before, and most weekends blurred together in a haze of emails, lazy breakfasts, and Netflix noise. I started looking for something that would break the pattern. It was a Wednesday morning when I first saw the listing for the cabin. Remote, tucked into the green patchwork hills of Devon, not far from Dartmoor, but far enough from any village to ensure peace and isolation. The photos showed a small, low-roofed place, with timber siding stained a deep brown. It had a porch, a working fireplace, and a little stream running nearby. No neighbors, no town lights, just trees and hills and sky. I booked it for the weekend, Friday through Monday. The listing had few reviews, just a couple of short comments. Peaceful place, basic but nice. That was good enough for me. I wanted basic. I wanted silence. By the time Friday rolled around, I'd packed up my car with everything I'd need. Food, firewood, a backpack, a flashlight, a power bank, and a paperback I'd been meaning to read for months. I left Exeter late in the afternoon, and after 2 hours of winding roads through villages and farmland, I turned off onto a narrow, overgrown track. My phone's signal vanished halfway down the path, just as the trees grew thicker and the sun started slipping behind the hills. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, smaller than I expected, but tidy. I parked beside it on a patch of gravel, shut off the engine, and just stood for a second, letting the silence press in. No wind,
No birds.
just the faint ticking of my engine cooling down. Inside, the cabin was clean and smelled faintly of wood smoke. The main room had a small bed on one side, a table and 2 chairs on the other, and a stone fireplace in the center of the far wall. There was a tiny kitchen area in the corner, just a sink, a gas stove, and a counter.
No free. No Wi-Fi, obviously.
I settled in easily. That first night, I made pasta, read until the light faded, then started a fire in the hearth. It was warm and comforting, with the logs popping and the shadows dancing on the walls. I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from the world, how there was a certain peace in being unreachable. I fell asleep quickly with the fire burning low. The next morning, I woke up to gray skies and a damp chill in the air. I made some tea, pulled on my boots, and decided to explore a bit. There wasn't much around, just dense woods and narrow trails, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. I walked for about 2 hours, looping around to the east, then heading back uphill toward the cabin. It started raining just as I reached the clearing. That afternoon, I stayed inside, made a small lunch, and read more of the book. The rain never really stopped, just slowed down into a light drizzle. Around 4 p.m., I thought I heard something. A faint sound like someone walking on wet ground, leaves shifting under boots. I paused, turned my head, and listened. It was faint and gone in seconds. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The forest is alive, especially when it's wet. Deer, foxes, birds. You hear things. But I did glance out the window more than once after that. By dusk, I had a small fire going again, and the cabin felt cozy. I cooked some tinned soup on the stove and tried not to think too hard about work, or my phone sitting useless in my bag. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something strange. There were wet footprints on the porch. Not boot prints, bare feet. Small, narrow, probably a woman's. They came up the steps from the left side, stopped just short of the door, and turned around again. The wood was damp and dark, so the prints stood out in the fading light. I stared at them for a long time, just standing inside the door. Then I opened it and stepped out slowly, looking into the trees. Nothing. I walked around the cabin, heart picking up, eyes scanning the woods. No sound, no movement. The prints were fresh, no more than an hour old. I was sure of it. I didn't know what to do. Could have been someone lost. Or maybe someone who knew the area. But why not knock? Why come barefoot in the rain? I stayed awake that night longer than I wanted to, watching the fire until it died down. I kept listening, but heard nothing. When I finally did fall asleep, it was a light, uneasy rest. The next day was clear but cold. I went outside first thing and checked the ground. No new prints, no signs of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, had stood just outside while I sat inside. Unaware, I tried to ignore it. I made breakfast, then decided to walk west this time, toward a patch of rocky hills I'd seen on the map. I hiked for maybe 3 hours, took some photos, and ate a sandwich on a rock overlooking the valley. But I kept checking behind me. Every crack of a branch made me pause. Every shadow looked off. I kept thinking about those bare feet. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I felt better. The sun helped. I chopped some firewood from a small stack out back and took it slow. Around 5 p.m., I went inside, started the fire, and made a strong cup of tea. I sat by the window and watched the woods, and that's when I saw her. She was standing behind a tree about 30 meters away, just off to the right side of the clearing. Thin, pale, wearing what looked like an old coat, torn and dirty. Her feet were bare. Her hair hung wet and stringy across her face, and I couldn't see her eyes clearly. She didn't move. She just stood there, mostly hidden behind the tree, her head tilted slightly like she was watching. I froze. My mug was halfway to my mouth. I slowly set it down and backed away from the window. I felt sick cold all over. My brain tried to explain it. Maybe she was a hiker. Maybe she was lost. But she hadn't come forward. She hadn't called out. I waited for what felt like an hour. Then I dared to look again. She was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the small table against the front door and sat in the chair with a fire poker across my knees. I didn't turn out the lights. Every time the wind rattled a branch, I flinched. My eyes felt like sand by 4 a.m. Still, I waited until dawn before I dared lie down. I should have left then. I know that now. I should have packed my things, hiked down the track, and called for a lift from the nearest pub or farmhouse. But I didn't. Something in me didn't want to run. I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real, that it was just in my head. Sunday morning was dry and cold again. I went outside with a knife in my pocket and looked around. I followed where she'd been, scanning the mud, the moss, the leaves, and I found something. Near the tree where she'd stood, there was a patch of flattened grass and a thin plastic bag, weathered, stained. Inside was a filthy pair of socks and a half-rotted apple. That was it. Kept it. I don't know why. I wrapped it in another bag and set it by the door. Then I walked the perimeter of the clearing again and again. I didn't see her, but the silence felt wrong. That night, I left every light on. I barely moved from the window. I didn't cook, didn't read. I just waited. It was close to midnight when I saw her again. This time closer, maybe 10 meters from the front porch, standing beside the woodshed. She was staring at the door. Couldn't breathe. I just watched. She didn't move for almost 10 minutes. Then slowly, she turned and walked off into the woods. Again, silent, barefoot, vanishing like mist between the trees. I waited another hour before stepping outside. My flashlight caught wet prints again. Fresh ones, leading away from the shed and back into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. By dawn, I had made my decision. I packed everything quickly, doused the fire, and got into the car. The tires skidded a bit on the wet track, but I didn't stop. I drove fast, reckless, until I reached the main road. By the time I got home to Exeter, I felt like I was waking up from something, like a fever breaking. I took a long shower, made tea, and sat in silence, trying to make sense of it all. I reported it, of course. I called the local non-emergency number and told them what I'd seen. They sent a PCSO to my flat the next day. He was polite, took notes, and told me it wasn't the first time someone had mentioned strange sightings near that patch of woods. He said they'd send someone out to check the area. That was it. Weeks passed. I went back to work. I stopped talking about it. My friends would have thought I was making it up. I stopped renting cabins. I sold most of my hiking gear, but I never threw away that plastic bag I found. I kept it sealed, buried deep in my closet. A reminder, the scariest part of all this wasn't the way she looked. It wasn't even that she kept coming back. It was that she never once tried to speak. Not a knock, not a cry for help, just silence. She knew I was there, and for some reason that was enough for her. That's what still wakes me up sometimes. Just the thought of her, standing there in the dark, watching. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and go off into the mountains of Montana for a while. It was early September 2019. I had been working nonstop for years. Construction jobs, odd shifts, long weeks, no time to breathe. One night I sat on my couch in Billings, watching the ceiling fan spin in the dark, and just thought, I need to go somewhere quiet. Somewhere away from traffic, from people, from phones. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't even tell my friends where I was going. I figured a few days alone in a cabin would do me good. I booked a small place through a site that listed private land rentals. A man named Hank, probably in his 60s, owned it. He lived about 20 miles south of the spot, and he had this isolated old cabin way out past Dillon Ridge. It wasn't listed on any official park maps, but you could get there with a 4x4 truck and some patience. It had no Wi-Fi, no running water, and no cell signal. The cabin ran on a propane tank and a small solar panel for lights. There was an outhouse about 30 yards out back. It was surrounded by trees, thick ones, tall and narrow, packed close together. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove out on a Tuesday morning. It was about a 4-hour drive from Billings, most of it spent bouncing over dusty roads after I left the main highway. By the time I reached the property, it was almost 3 p.m. I hadn't passed another person in over an hour. The last sign of civilization was a battered gas station back down near Madison Forks. The final turnoff was an unmarked dirt trail that wound up into the woods like a dry creek bed. When I first saw the cabin, I thought it looked perfect. It was small but sturdy, made of thick logs and sitting on short concrete supports. The roof sloped steeply, and a stone chimney rose on one side. There were 3 windows, one in the front beside the door, one over the small sink inside, and one in the back near the cot. A set of wooden steps led up to the porch, and a short path of flattened grass wound toward the outhouse behind a row of young pines. I unpacked my things, just a backpack with clothes, a few cans of food, matches, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, and a small pistol I kept for peace of mind. I also had a radio, but it didn't pick up anything out there. Inside, it smelled of dry wood and old dust. The furniture was basic, an iron frame cot with a rolled-up wool blanket, a wooden table with a chair, and a small counter beside the sink. There was a cooler half buried in the ground outside that Hank told me to use as a fridge. I loaded in my food and water bottles, then took a deep breath and let it all settle. For the first time in months, I felt quiet. That first day passed without anything strange. I walked around the woods a bit, followed a game trail down to a dry creek bed, and even spotted some deer prints in the mud. I cooked beans on the small propane stove and sat on the steps that night, watching the sky turn dark above the treetops. There wasn't a sound except the wind and the occasional snapping branch in the distance. The second day, though, something felt different. It started early. I woke up before sunrise, maybe around 5. The sky was still dark, and there was this strange pressure in my head, like when you go up in altitude too fast. I lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering what woke me up. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, after a minute or two, I realized something was off. The woods were silent, completely, not just quiet, dead still.
No birds, no bugs, no breeze.
I got out of bed and stood by the back window. The trees were motionless, the sky barely turning pale. I couldn't even hear the usual creaking of the cabin as it warmed up. Just stillness. I stepped outside barefoot, thinking maybe I was imagining it. The ground was cold and damp. I walked around the side of the cabin, past the outhouse trail, and just stood still, listening. Nothing. I held my breath and waited. Then I heard it. A crack. Far off through the trees. Maybe 100 yards north. Something broke a stick. Not a small one either. It sounded like someone stepped hard on a thick branch. I stood frozen. Another crack followed a few seconds later, same direction, then silence again. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer, or an elk, maybe even a moose. But the next noise made me doubt that. It was a thud, like something hit the ground flat. Not a stomp, a thud, followed by the faintest sound of scraping, something dragging. I slowly backed up toward the cabin and went inside. Locked the door. I stood by the front window and kept my eyes on the tree line for a long time. Nothing ever came out. The rest of that day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, reading an old paperback I found in the drawer. Around noon, the normal sounds came back: birds, breeze, bugs. I began to wonder if I'd just imagined it, but I couldn't shake that sense of something watching me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about the sound of something dragging through the woods. On the third day, I found the tracks. I had decided to check the area where I thought I heard the noise the morning before. I walked about 100 yards north, keeping my bearings with a compass. The forest was thick, and the ground was uneven, covered in dry pine needles, moss, and broken branches. After about 15 minutes, I found them, clear as day. Footprints, bare feet, not boots, not shoes, bare human feet. The prints were deep, spaced wide apart, and the toes dug into the soil like whoever made them was running or stepping with force. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old, but they were unmistakable. I followed them for a while, then lost them near a cluster of downed trees. I turned back fast. My stomach was twisting. I couldn't explain it. Why would someone be out here barefoot? There were no other cabins nearby.
No trals.
I hadn't seen a single person since I left the highway. I stayed near the cabin the rest of the day. Around dusk, I set up a small tripwire with a can and some string along the trail to the outhouse, just for peace of mind. I didn't expect anything. I was just being careful. At 3:17 a.m. that night, the can rattled. I woke instantly, my whole body tensed. I stayed still for a full minute before moving. Then I grabbed my pistol, crept out of bed, and stood by the window. The moon was bright enough that I could see faint shapes outside. Trees, the trail, shadows. I saw nothing. Then I heard breathing, faint, heavy. It wasn't mine. It was outside, near the corner of the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The breathing stopped. Then soft steps, slow, dragging steps, moved past the window. I ducked. Whatever it was, it paused near the front porch. Then another step. Then another. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I went outside with the pistol and checked everything. The can was lying on the ground, string snapped. There were smudges in the dirt. No clear prints, but something had definitely passed through. That was the day I wanted to leave. I packed everything. I didn't care about the rental. I just wanted to go. But when I tried to start the truck, the engine wouldn't turn over. Battery was dead. I had no idea why. It was a new battery. No lights had been left on. I opened the hood. Everything looked fine. No signs of damage. I tried again. Nothing. I sat in the truck for a while, staring at the trees. My hands were shaking. My mind was running in circles. I had no signal, no way to call out. The nearest building was over an hour's walk downhill, and I wasn't sure I could make it before dark. So I made a plan. I'd leave first thing the next morning. Walk fast. Keep the pistol ready. Stick to the trail. If I could make it to the gas station I passed on the way in, I could find help there. I just had to make it one more night. That night, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, waiting. At around 2 a.m., I heard steps again, this time slower, more deliberate. They circled the cabin, then stopped. Then I heard the sound of something being dragged across the front porch. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds. Then silence. No footsteps walking away.
No breathing.
Just silence. I didn't move until daylight. When I finally stepped outside, I saw something on the porch that hadn't been there the day before. A dead rabbit. Its neck twisted. The stomach split open. No blood. Just left there. Like an offering. Or a warning. I walked out that morning with my pack and my gun. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I was being followed. I didn't stop until I reached the highway near noon. A rancher in a pickup finally stopped and helped me get to town. I told the sheriff what happened. He sent someone out to check. They found the cabin. Nothing else.
No prints.
No sign of the rabbit. Nothing. A week later, the rental listing disappeared from the site. I never heard from Hank again. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. Something was watching me. Not a ghost, not a monster. Person. A real, living person. And I was completely alone. I haven't gone back to the woods since. My name is Nathan. I was 32 at the time, and this happened in 2017. I had just gone through a rough breakup, quit my job at a small construction firm, and needed time to clear my head. My Uncle Brian owned a farm in southern Iowa, about 2 hours from Des Moines, and he let me stay at one of the old cabins on his property. The cabin was about half a mile from the main farmhouse, down a dirt path and through a thick stretch of trees. It had no running water, no phone service, and no internet. But that's exactly what I was looking for. The cabin was built back in the 60s, used mostly during harvest season when extra hands would stay over. It hadn't been used in years, but it was still in good shape. Small kitchen, wood-burning stove, a single bedroom with a cot, and an outhouse about 20 yards behind it. No insulation really, so the cold came through the walls at night. It had a musty smell, like old hay and dry rot, but nothing unbearable. There was also an old shed next to it, full of rusted tools, boxes of nails, and broken farm equipment. Everything around it looked like it had been left in a hurry. I planned to stay a full week. I brought a cooler full of food, a gas lantern, some books, and my hunting rifle. I wasn't there to hunt, just felt better having it around. I also brought my dog, Scout, a 6-year-old German Shepherd I'd had since he was a pup, loyal, alert, and always calm. If something was off, I trusted he'd pick up on it. The first couple of days were peaceful. I woke up early, chopped some wood, cooked over the fire pit, and spent the evenings reading or walking through the fields. Scout stuck close to me. He'd run off for a few minutes now and then, but he never wandered too far. The weather was chilly, but dry. I felt like I was finally getting my head straight. On the third day, things started to feel different. It was early afternoon. I was about a mile from the cabin, walking along the edge of the tree line, when I noticed Scout stop dead in his tracks. He stared into the woods, ears perked, body stiff. I followed his gaze, but didn't see anything at first. Then, after a few seconds, I heard something. Not an animal sound. Something more like a heavy step. Not a deer either, more solid. I froze and listened. Nothing. Just the wind through the trees. Scout didn't move. I knelt down, whispered to him to come, and slowly backed away. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Then, after maybe a minute, he trotted back to me like nothing happened. I told myself it was probably a coyote or a raccoon, maybe even a boar. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and the trees scraped against the roof. I kept hearing noises, thuds, rustles outside the cabin. Every time I peeked out with my flashlight, nothing was there. But Scout stayed close to the door, sitting up, alert. Around 2 a.m., he growled once, low and deep. I grabbed the rifle and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a wall. I stood there for 5 minutes, scanning the trees. Nothing. The next day, I noticed something strange. Behind the shed, about 20 feet into the brush, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. The dirt was loose, dark, and there were shallow trenches about 2 feet long. It didn't look like animal digging, too neat. I figured maybe Brian or one of the farmhands had been burying trash or something. Still, it bugged me. That afternoon, I walked to the farmhouse to ask Brian about it. He wasn't there. His truck was gone. I left a note on the door, then walked back. The sky was dark by the time I got near the cabin, and I took the long path around the shed. That's when I noticed something else. The shed door was open, I hadn't opened it that day. I stood still, watching it sway slightly in the breeze. My heart was pounding. I walked over slowly, rifle ready. I shined my flashlight inside. Everything looked the same. Old tools, boxes, broken parts. Nothing moved. But the smell was worse than I remembered. Not just musty, something sharper, like rot. I shut the door, latched it, and went inside the cabin. Scout wouldn't stop pacing. He sniffed the door, whined, then scratched at it. I opened it so he could look around, but he just stood on the porch, staring into the dark. That night was the worst one yet. I just started to drift off when I heard it. A scraping sound. Not the trees. This was slower, closer, like something brushing against the outside wall of the cabin. I sat up, held my breath, listened. Then I heard it again, this time near the back window. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it through the glass. Nothing. Then Scout growled again, this time louder. I grabbed the rifle, opened the door fast, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me again, and the night was dead quiet. I stepped off the porch and walked around the cabin. The flashlight beam danced over the dirt and wood. Then I saw them. Footprints. Human ones. Barefoot. They led from the side of the shed to the back of the cabin. I followed them slowly. They were deep, clear in the dirt. Not very big. Maybe a size 9 or 10. They stopped near the window. Then nothing. No return path. Like whoever it was just disappeared. I walked to the shed again and pulled open the door. The smell hit me harder this time. Something was definitely dead inside. I shined the flashlight along the ground and froze. In the corner, half buried in straw and junk, was a dead raccoon. His body was torn open, ribs showing. Flies swarmed it, but that wasn't what stopped me. Next to it, nailed into the wall, was a small wooden board with something carved into it. Letters. I stepped closer. I see you. The carving was rough, uneven, fresh. I left the shed, slammed the door, and locked it with a rusted padlock I found hanging on the side. Then I went inside the cabin and stayed up the rest of the night, sitting with the rifle in my lap. Scout didn't sleep either. The next morning, I walked back to the shed with the daylight behind me. The door was still locked. I left it alone. I decided I was done. I packed my cooler, stuffed my clothes back into the duffel, and waited for Brian to get back. But he never came that day. No call, no truck. My phone had 1 bar, but no data. I texted him but got no reply. I didn't want to walk the 5 miles to the nearest road, but I was getting close to doing just that. That night, just before sundown, I heard something in the woods again, but this time it was faster, heavier, like running. Scout started barking like crazy. I grabbed the rifle and went out to the porch. Something ran across the clearing in front of the cabin. I only saw it for a second. Thin, fast, low to the ground. Human-like, but wrong. It didn't run like a person. It moved crooked, like its joints didn't bend right. I yelled without meaning to. Scout took off after it. I called him back, but he disappeared into the trees. He didn't come back. I waited. I stood on the porch for an hour, flashlight sweeping, calling for him. Nothing. I stayed up all night again, hoping to hear his bark or footsteps. Still nothing. The next morning, I found blood in the clearing, drops leading into the woods. I followed them for almost a mile, rifle shaking in my hands. Then I found his collar. Just the collar. No body. No signs of a struggle. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked back to the cabin, packed everything, and left. Hauled my gear across the fields, up the old dirt road, and didn't stop until I hit the highway. A guy in a pickup saw me and gave me a ride to town. I got a motel room and stayed there that night. Brian didn't answer any calls or messages. 2 days later, he finally called. Said he'd been out of town helping a neighbor fix their roof. He hadn't been home. He hadn't seen Scout. I told him everything. The digging, the shed, the carvings, the thing I saw in the woods. He went silent for a few seconds, then said something I'll never forget. I told those guys to stay out of that cabin. I locked the shed for a reason. That was it.
No explanation.
No follow-up, just that. A week later, I got a box in the mail. No return address. Inside was Scout's tag, just the metal tag from his collar, wrapped in brown paper. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was living out there, but someone was watching me. Someone had been watching that place for a long time. I can still see those bare footprints in the dirt, leading to the window and going nowhere. My name's Daniel Heller. I'm 37 now, but this happened when I was 29. It was late September 2016. I had just moved back to Oregon after spending 5 years in Texas working odd jobs. I'd been bouncing between welding, construction, and some seasonal forestry gigs. I moved back to take care of my dad's affairs after he passed from a heart condition. I inherited the small house he left behind in Tillamook County, and I figured it was a good enough place to reset my life. Quiet, remote, a couple of hours from the coast. The air smelled like pine and salt. My dad wasn't a rich man. He worked at the paper mill most of his life, didn't have much in the way of savings, but he left a small portfolio of junky tools, beat-up vehicles, and old property deeds. Most were worthless or just tiny slivers of woods that had long been overgrown. One of those deeds was for a patch of land way up in the hills near the edge of the Siuslaw Forest, almost a full acre with an old, crumbling hunting cabin on it. I didn't even know we owned it. The papers had it marked Miller's Hollow. I remembered my dad mentioning it once when I was a kid, something about helping his uncle build it way back in the early 70s. It wasn't listed on any modern maps, and the access road had been closed off by the county years ago because of landslides. I only found it again after asking an old friend of my dad's named Rick, who remembered going up there once back in the 90s to hunt deer. I don't know what made me want to go there. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe I was still dealing with everything after my dad died. I wasn't in a good headspace. I wasn't sleeping well. Sometimes I'd wake up feeling like I'd forgotten something huge, something important. I'd pace the floor in my socks until the sun came up. It felt like my brain was trying to grab something, some idea that kept slipping away. I guess I thought getting out into the woods would help me clear things out. Maybe clean up the cabin, restore it. I even thought about turning it into a side project, somewhere to go on weekends. I packed light, just my old hiking backpack with food, water, my camping gear, and a .22 rifle for small game. I didn't think I'd need much. The GPS couldn't find the road, but Rick had drawn a rough sketch on a napkin the last time I saw him. It took me the better part of a morning to even find the old trail. The path was overgrown, barely wide enough for a four-wheeler, and thick with blackberry bramble. I parked my truck at the bottom of the hill and walked the rest of the way in. It was late afternoon when I finally found the cabin. From a distance, it looked like part of the forest. The roof had half collapsed. Ivy and wild rose bushes had grown over the eastern wall. It was smaller than I expected, just a one-room structure with a lean-to off the back. The front porch had rotted clean through, but the door was still intact. Everything was quiet. No birds, no wind, just the creaking of the trees above me and the buzzing of flies. Inside, the smell hit me first: damp wood, mold, and old animal droppings. There was a single table in the corner, its legs broken, a rusted metal cot folded against the far wall. A pile of old firewood sat beneath a cracked window. Someone had left a tin cup and a knife on the windowsill, both covered in rust. There were no signs of recent life. No beer cans, no wrappers, no footprints in the dust. Just old decay. But there was something strange too. Scratches along the inside of the door. deep, erratic grooves like someone had tried to claw their way out. I ran my fingers over them. They were old, weathered, but it didn't make sense. Why would someone be inside clawing out? I told myself maybe a raccoon or porcupine got trapped in there once. It didn't sit right, but I was tired and sore, and I figured I'd clean up a bit, patch the roof with my tarp, and sleep there for the night. As the sun went down, I set up camp inside the cabin. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cleanest spot of floor I could find, started a small fire in the stone hearth, and heated up a can of chili. I sat in silence, listening to the popping of the fire and the wind outside. At some point, I dozed off. I woke up around 2 a.m. The fire had gone out. It was pitch black inside. I couldn't see anything. I lay still, listening. There was a sound, slow, steady creaking. Not from the wind or the trees, but from inside the cabin. The kind of sound old would make when someone's stepping on it carefully, like they don't want to be heard. My stomach tightened. I held my breath and reached slowly for my flashlight. I clicked it on and swept the beam across the cabin. Nothing, just the same crumbling walls, the table, the rusted cot. But something felt off. I stood up, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, and checked the door. It was still latched shut from the inside. The window hadn't been broken. No signs of animals. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I tried to laugh it off. I told myself it was just the structure settling, or maybe a branch hitting the roof. But I kept thinking about those scratches on the door. The more I thought about them, the less they made sense. That day, I explored the area around the cabin. Behind the lean-to, there was an old trail, barely visible, heading deeper into the trees. I followed it for maybe half a mile before I found what looked like a collapsed outhouse and, a bit farther on, a narrow pit dug into the earth. It was overgrown, but I could tell it had been man-made. Probably a root cellar or cold storage. I tried lifting the wooden cover, but it was too heavy and half-rotted into the ground. I moved on. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to clear some space around the building. I found old wire traps, broken tools, and a rusted axe. The more I uncovered, the stranger it felt. Everything seemed like it had just been dropped and left, like whoever had lived here left in a hurry. That night, I heard the sound again, creaking, faint, careful steps. Only this time, I knew I wasn't dreaming. I sat up, heart pounding, and held my breath. The noise stopped the moment I moved. I clicked on my flashlight again and aimed it around the room. Still nothing. But I noticed something I hadn't before. The cot, folded against the wall, was now leaning at a different angle. I stood, walked over, and checked it. Behind the cot, hidden in the wall, was a small wooden door, no bigger than a kitchen cabinet. It looked like it led into the crawl space between the walls. I opened it. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could see that it went deeper than it should have. Like there was a hollow space carved behind the cabin's back wall. A few pieces of old cloth and rope were inside, and something else. Bones. Not human, but animal. Small ones. Maybe raccoon or possum. But they'd been stripped clean and arranged in piles. I shut the hatch and didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed my gear and left. I didn't even stop to eat. I hiked back down the hill as fast as I could, heart thudding in my chest the whole way. The forest felt wrong now, too still, too quiet. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but 3 weeks later I did. I don't know why. Maybe it was stupid curiosity. Maybe I thought I imagined some of it. But something kept pulling at me, like I needed to understand what had happened there. I came better prepared. A proper flashlight, trail markers, my phone with extra batteries, and my dad's old hunting shotgun. When I got back to the cabin, nothing had changed. The door was still shut, the cot still folded, but I went straight to the hidden crawl space. This time I crawled inside. The tunnel was longer than I thought. It went deep into the back hill. Whoever had carved it out had used hand tools. The walls were packed dirt, lined with old timber. I moved slowly, flashlight cutting through the thick air. Then I found it. A small room hidden beneath the hill. Inside were piles of things: rusted tins, moldy blankets, small bones, old shoes, and something else. Journals. Old damp notebooks, most unreadable. But one was still intact. The handwriting was shaky. I could only make out some lines. "He won't let me leave. Every time I try, the woods send me back. The cabin watches at night." I felt cold all over. Not scared from stories, but from the person who wrote them. Whoever lived here had lost their mind. Probably trapped for weeks, months, maybe years. I turned to leave and saw something carved into the wall behind me. It was a name.
Heller?
My last name. I stared at it for a long time. I think that was the moment it all clicked. This place belonged to my great-uncle John. My dad's uncle, the one I never met. He vanished back in 1982. No one ever found him. My dad mentioned once that he'd gone crazy in the woods, but I didn't think anything of it. He'd never left. He'd carved himself into the earth. I crawled out, heart pounding, stumbled outside into the light. I didn't take anything with me. I didn't even shut the cabin door. I ran all the way back to the truck. I never told anyone. Not the sheriff, not Rick, not even my sister. I didn't want anyone going up there. Some places are better left buried. I sold the land 6 months later to a timber company. Sometimes I dream about that cabin. Sometimes I see the name on the wall. Sometimes I hear the slow, steady creaking in the dark. But I never go back. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was late October 2019. My job in Kansas City was wearing me down. Long hours in front of a screen, late nights, and a constant feeling that I was slowly drifting away from myself. I worked as a mechanical inspector for a construction firm, mostly driving between sites, checking foundations, overseeing welding quality, things like that. I wasn't bad at it, but I was getting to that point where every day felt like a repeat of the last. I hadn't taken any real time off in almost 2 years, so I told the office I was going to be out for a while. No phone, no laptop, just time away. I found a listing on a small forum that catered to people interested in off-grid cabins. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. Just an old guy who posted photos of his remote getaway, tucked into the hills near Leadville, Colorado. He said it was once used by his uncle, who had worked as a groundskeeper at a now-abandoned graveyard nearby. The cabin hadn't been touched in years, but the structure was sound, and the wood stove still worked. That was all I needed. I packed my truck with enough food and supplies for 2 weeks. Cans, pasta, coffee, propane, a few tools, and my rifle in case I needed it. Not for hunting, just peace of mind. I left early on a Tuesday, made the 12-hour drive straight through, and pulled up to the property just after dark. There wasn't much to see at night. Just tall pines, some overgrown shrubs, and the faint outline of the cabin about 50 yards off the dirt path. I parked the truck under some trees and walked up with a flashlight. The air was thin, cold, and smelled like damp bark and old earth. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with a tin roof and logs that had gone almost black from weather. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The wood creaked under my boots. It was musty like mold and mice, but it wasn't too bad. There was a cot, a table, a wood stove, a couple of shelves, and a chair with one leg shorter than the rest. I swept the floor with an old broom someone had left leaning against the wall and unpacked. By the next morning, I had a small fire going in the stove. The light through the windows made the dust in the air visible, dancing in long, slow spirals. I sat at the table with a cup of instant coffee, staring out into the woods. I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. No notifications, no traffic, no meetings, just wind in the trees and the creak of the cabin settling. Around noon, I decided to explore. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and walked uphill through the trees, trying to find the graveyard the owner had mentioned. After about 20 minutes of weaving between dead branches and dried out ferns, I found it. It wasn't much, maybe 20 or 30 headstones, many of them tilted or sunken. Some were just rough stones with no markings. Others had dates going back to the 1800s. It was fenced in by rotting wooden posts and rusty wire, barely standing in places. The place looked forgotten but not vandalized, just neglected. I stood there for a while trying to read names. Most had been worn away. The grass was yellow and dry, and the wind had picked up enough to make the trees whisper. I didn't stay long. Something about being in that graveyard alone made me uncomfortable. Not afraid, just unsettled. On the way back down, I noticed small stone markers outside the fenced area too, hidden under leaves and roots. Maybe unmarked graves, or maybe people just used to bury folks wherever there was space. That night, I didn't sleep well. It wasn't the cold or the bed. It was the sound. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a noise outside, something crunching leaves slowly, like deliberate footsteps. I stayed still in the dark, listening. It wasn't an animal. Too slow, too even. I reached over and quietly took my rifle from beside the cot. I didn't point it at the door, just held it in my lap. The footsteps stopped after maybe a minute, then nothing. No breathing, no rustling, just silence. In the morning, I went outside and checked the ground around the cabin. There were some faint impressions in the leaves, but nothing clear. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk walking through, maybe even someone hiking the area. But the nearest house was 5 miles away. There weren't even utility lines out here. I spent the next few days chopping small wood, boiling snow for water, and journaling. I walked the trails during the day and kept the stove going at night. The more time passed, the more I started noticing strange little things. One morning, I found a dead rabbit on the porch. No blood,
No bite marks.
just stiff and cold, eyes open. It hadn't been there the night before. Another time, I came back from a walk and found the cabin door wide open. I was sure I had shut it. The wind couldn't have done it, the latch was old, but it still worked. I started locking it from the inside with a wooden wedge, just in case. About a week in, I went back up to the graveyard. This time, I brought a small folding shovel and gloves. I wasn't planning to dig up anything. I just wanted to clear the brush and see the stones better. Something about the place made me want to map it out, like documenting it would make it feel less eerie. I marked the edges with sticks, counted the graves, made notes. But one thing didn't sit right. Near the back corner, just past a leaning tree stump, the earth looked different, more sunken, darker, and oddly square-shaped. I pressed my boot into it, and the dirt collapsed a little more than the rest. I told myself to leave it alone, but later that night, the idea kept coming back to me. Maybe it was a collapsed grave, or maybe some old wooden box rotted underneath. The next morning, I went up with my shovel and started digging. The first few inches were just dry soil, roots, and worms. Then I hit something hard, a flat board, not a coffin, just a piece of wood laid across the top of a shallow pit. I cleared more away and lifted it. Underneath, there was a hole, just dirt walls maybe 3 feet deep, and at the bottom, nothing. No bones, no box, just a bunch of dried leaves. But something about the way it was shaped, it didn't feel like an old grave. It felt like someone had dug it more recently. I filled the hole back in, tamped it down, and left. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. Who would dig a fake grave up here? Or reuse an old one? That night, I woke again to movement outside. This time, I sat up quickly and looked out the window. There was no moon, but my eyes adjusted. About 20 feet from the cabin, just near the tree line, I saw someone, or something, a shape, not moving, just standing. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could tell it was a person. I watched for a long time. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, barely visible. After what felt like forever, I turned to get my rifle. When I looked back, it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I hiked down to where I'd parked the truck. I wanted to make sure it was still there. But the back hatch was open. I hadn't opened it since I arrived. Nothing seemed stolen, but a couple of the supply boxes had been moved around. One of the fuel cans was missing. I was angry now. I didn't care if it was some weirdo squatter or a hunter playing games. I packed some of my things and thought about heading out. But then I told myself I was being paranoid. I had 4 days left. I'd come here to get away from stress, not to run from shadows. That night, I set up a little tripwire using fishing line and tin cans across the front path. I also placed a few broken branches in the back, so I'd hear if someone stepped on them. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my knees, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a can rattle. I moved slowly to the door, peeking out. Something was out there again, this time closer. I couldn't see a face, but the figure looked tall. Not huge, just long-limbed. It was crouched down near the edge of the porch, like it was studying the door. I stayed still, heart pounding, until it backed away and disappeared into the woods. I didn't go outside until morning. After that, I decided to leave. I packed everything I could, doused the fire, and drove back to town. I didn't stop until I reached a diner about 40 miles away. I sat at the counter with a hot coffee, hands still shaking a little. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't call the owner either. I didn't want to explain what happened, or what I saw, or try to make sense of it. There was no crime, no evidence, no violence, but it was clear that someone else was out there, watching, maybe living nearby, maybe using the old graveyard paths to move around unseen. I looked it up later. That area near Leadville used to have a mining town back in the day, with its own burial grounds. When the town collapsed in the early 1900s, people left, but not everyone got moved. Some say transients lived in the woods during the Depression. Others said certain folks didn't like being found. I don't know who that figure was, or why the fake grave was there. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt, and it felt real. I still go camping sometimes, but never near graveyards, and never alone. My name is Daniel Keller. I'm 43 now. This happened in 2021. I was living alone in Laramie, Wyoming. My ex-wife, Hannah, had passed away a couple of months before from liver failure. We'd been divorced for 5 years, and though we hadn't spoken much in the last 2, her death still messed with me. It didn't hit like losing a lover. It was more like losing a chapter of myself. Even after things went bad between us, she was still someone who had once known every part of me, every detail of my life. And then she was just gone, cremated, her ashes scattered by her sister in Oregon. There was this cabin up near Elkhead Ridge in northwest Colorado. We used to go there sometimes before we got married. It wasn't hers, but her friend Jessica let us borrow it now and then. An old A-frame in a patch of tall lodgepole pines. No electricity, no signal, no neighbors within a mile. Just a propane stove, a wood-burning heater, and a small creek behind it. I hadn't been back since before the divorce. Never had a reason to. But a week after the funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I figured maybe I just needed to get away. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere without people. So I emailed Jessica and asked if the cabin still existed. It did. She'd had a property manager in Steamboat Springs check on it once or twice a year, mostly to sweep out mice and clean the chimney. No one had stayed there in almost a decade. She gave me the code to the lockbox and said I could go up anytime I wanted. I packed up my truck with food, a few jugs of water, firewood, a .22 rifle, and my old hiking gear. I told my brother I was heading out for a week, maybe 2, depending on how I felt. He didn't ask many questions. I didn't offer any. It was early May, and the snow had mostly melted off, though the nights up in the hills still got below freezing. I crossed into Colorado late in the afternoon and hit the logging roads as the sun was dipping. The cabin was where I remembered it. Quiet, old, the windows fogged from condensation. The roof was still intact, but the wood siding had faded to a dull gray. I parked next to the shed, pulled my bag out, and just stood there for a minute. There was something about going back that made the silence feel heavy. Not peaceful, just full. Like the forest around me had stopped breathing, waiting for something. Inside, it smelled like dry pine, moldy canvas, and old mouse droppings. A few chewed-up rags sat in the corners. Some yellowed newspapers from 2013 were stacked beside the stove. I swept out a few dead beetles, checked under the mattress for mice, and made a small fire before the sun dropped fully behind the ridge. The first night was uneventful. I drank some instant coffee from a metal cup and listened to the wind in the trees. The quiet hit differently out there. It wasn't like the city, where quiet meant the hum of distant cars or the occasional dog bark. Out here, silence meant no sound at all.
No bugs, no birds.
Just wind, and even that wasn't constant. I went to sleep on the old mattress with my sleeping bag zipped around me, the fire in the stove burning low. I woke up around 3 a.m. and noticed it had gone completely out. I got up, threw on a flannel, and relit it. Nothing strange, just cold. The next morning, I hiked up a slope behind the cabin that led to a rocky outcrop Hannah used to call the crow's nest. From up there, you could see most of the valley, plus some of the ridge roads snaking down into the forest. It was all still beautiful, still untouched. I stayed up there an hour, didn't see another person, not even a distant truck.
No deer, no elk.
Just trees and wind. I climbed down, made eggs and beans on the propane stove, and spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin more thoroughly. It was the second night that things began to feel off. I was sitting by the stove, writing in a small notebook I'd brought, when I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the back wall. It was light, just a single thump. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. I figured maybe it was a branch falling or some animal brushing against the logs. I didn't go check. I just sat there. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time on the opposite wall. Not loud, but definitely deliberate. I grabbed the rifle and opened the front door, stepped out onto the porch. The cold air bit through my shirt. My breath came out in white clouds. I walked around the cabin slowly. Nothing. No tracks. No animals. When I got back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. The old curtain by the back window had been pushed aside. Just slightly. Enough to make me feel like someone might have been standing there, looking in. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I hiked out along the creek for a couple of miles, trying to shake the unease. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe even guilt. Maybe something in me was trying to link the cabin with Hannah, trying to make this into a sad, symbolic retreat. I tried to ignore it, but that afternoon, while collecting branches near the slope, I saw something across the clearing. A man. He was standing far off, maybe 150 yards away, half behind a tree, just standing. I raised my hand to wave, and he stepped back, disappearing behind the trunk. When I moved toward the spot, he was gone.
No footprints.
No sound of movement, just trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe my mind playing with shadows, but something in my gut tightened. That night, I slept with the rifle beside me. I woke around 1 a.m. to a soft sound outside, not knocking this time, a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the porch. I held my breath. The sound moved from left to right, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't go to the window. I just sat up slowly in my sleeping bag and waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I crept toward the door, gently pulled it open, and peeked out. There was a long scuff mark across the porch boards, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I stepped out with the rifle raised, flashlight clipped under it. I scanned the trees, still nothing. But when I turned to look back at the cabin, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The curtain in the front window had been pulled wide open. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't opened it. I would have remembered. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what the hell to do. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But I also knew that wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. Someone had touched that curtain. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the stove with the rifle in my lap. In the morning, I walked the perimeter again. Still no tracks. Still no sign of anyone. But something had changed. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt watched. I lasted 2 more nights. On the 4th day, I decided to pack up early and leave. I figured maybe I wasn't ready to be out there. Maybe the place just held too much from the past. I loaded everything into the truck just before dusk. I double-checked the stove was out, the windows latched. But when I opened the back of the truck to toss in my sleeping bag, I saw it. A pile of pine cones, carefully arranged, stacked into a small pyramid, right in the middle of the bed. I hadn't done that, and on top of the pine cones, there was a single photograph. It was one I hadn't seen in years. Me and Hannah, sitting on the porch of this cabin, smiling. She had her arm through mine. My hair was longer then. We both looked happy, but I hadn't brought that photo. It wasn't in my bag. It wasn't in the cabin. It shouldn't have been anywhere. That was the moment I realized I hadn't been alone at all. I slammed the tailgate shut, got in, and drove out fast, not even bothering to close the gate at the end of the property trail. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole drive back. I never reported anything, never told Jessica. I don't know how that photo ended up there. I don't know who was knocking or dragging things or watching me, but I do know this: Hannah didn't leave it. And I wasn't alone in those woods. I've never been back, and I never will. I was 37 when I decided to take a break from everything for a week and stay alone in a cabin in Southern Oregon. This was back in late October of 2016. I had been working nonstop for the past year doing security work at a warehouse in Eugene. Long nights, rotating shifts, barely any time to think. My doctor told me I was burned out. I didn't feel it at the time, but I listened. I figured the fresh air and quiet would help me reset. The cabin belonged to my old friend's uncle, but he had moved to Florida and wasn't using it anymore. It was deep in the woods near a place called Prospect, not far from the Rogue River. He told me I could use it anytime as long as I cleaned up after. There was no electricity, no cell reception, and the nearest town was about 25 miles down a winding dirt road. But it had a small wood stove, a water pump outside, and an outhouse about 30 feet behind the back porch. Enough to live. I drove in just after a light rainstorm had passed through. The gravel road was soft with puddles, and the trees were dripping. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low, casting a yellow glow across the clearing. The cabin stood in the center like a wooden box, weathered and gray, with a slanted metal roof and a short porch that looked like it could collapse under too much weight. There were moss patches on the steps and a few logs piled on the side. A narrow footpath wound around the back where the outhouse stood. Inside, it smelled like dust, wood, and old paper. It wasn't big, just one room with a cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some cooking pots, and a trunk with old clothes and yellowing newspapers. The only window was above the table. I opened it to let in some air, swept the floor with a broom, then started unpacking the supplies I brought. Dry food, a small gas stove, coffee, a flashlight, a couple of knives, and a shortwave radio. I also brought a lever-action rifle, just in case I ran into any cougars or something worse. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch in my jacket, listening to the wind through the trees. It got cold fast once the sun dipped, and I went back inside to light the stove. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and ate them slowly, looking out at the darkness through the open door. It was quiet, too quiet. No cars,
No planes.
no distant hum of people or machines, just the creak of wood, the flicker of fire, and my own breath. I slept light, waking up several times from small noises, branches tapping, leaves rustling, the thump of something soft landing on the roof. I kept the rifle leaned against the cot. Just knowing it was there helped me sleep. The second day, I hiked down the trail that led toward the river. I didn't bring a map because I wasn't going far, just looking around. I found some old tire tracks about half a mile in deep ruts, partly washed away by the rain. They looked fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. No big deal, I figured. Could have been a hunter or someone checking the fire roads. But still, I felt something strange in my gut when I stood over them, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I spent most of the day chopping some logs, stacking them near the back wall, fixing up the latch on the door, and sitting by the fire reading an old hunting magazine I found in the trunk. Around 7 p.m., while it was getting dark, I stepped outside to use the outhouse. That's when I noticed something odd. The trail behind the cabin, the one I came in on, had what looked like fresh boot prints. I walked closer, crouched, and stared at them. The mud was soft, and the treads were clear. The thing was, I hadn't walked back out that way since I arrived. My boots were a different pattern. These looked wider with thick lugs, like work boots or hiking boots, and they weren't there earlier that day. I was sure of it. I stood there for a while, scanning the trees. Nothing moved.
No birds. No breeze.
Everything was still. I tried telling myself someone had passed by, maybe looked around and left, but I hadn't heard anything. And who would be out here walking this far in without stopping by? I went back inside and locked the door with the latch I had just fixed. I kept the fire going and sat at the table, facing the window. I didn't read. I just sat there watching the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not an animal, not the wind. It was soft, deliberate. A footstep on dry leaves. Then another. Then it stopped. I grabbed the rifle, moved to the window, and peeked out. Nothing. I stood there for 20 minutes. Not a sound. I thought maybe it was my imagination, maybe a deer, but something about it felt off. The next morning, I circled the cabin, looking for tracks. There were more of them. Same boots, this time closer, right up to the front steps, and then around the back. I felt sick. Someone had walked around the cabin while I was sleeping, just walking. No attempt to break in. No sign of struggle or digging. Just walking. I packed a day bag, took the rifle, and hiked the trail south toward where the old fire road curved around the hills. I followed it a couple of miles, trying to spot tire tracks or signs of anyone camping nearby. I found nothing.
No smoke, no wrappers, no tents.
Just trees, cold wind, and dead leaves. I headed back around noon. When I got close to the clearing, I stopped. Something was different. There was a smell in the air, faint but sharp, like old gasoline. I moved slower, rifle ready. When I stepped into the clearing, I saw it. The door was open. I stood frozen for maybe a minute. Then I walked in, slow and quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. My bag was still there, the food untouched, the cot still made. But the rifle I had left leaning against the wall was now laying on the floor. I never left it like that. Someone had been inside. I checked everything again. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. Whoever it was, they didn't take anything. They didn't leave a message. They just went in, looked around, and left. That was worse than if they had stolen something. It was like a warning without words. I locked the door again and pushed the table in front of it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up, eyes wide, heart pounding. I kept the rifle next to me, finger near the trigger guard. I watched the window until the sun came up. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if it meant ending the trip early. I wasn't staying one more night in that cabin. I packed everything fast, barely ate. When I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Nailed to a tree just beyond the clearing at eye level was a strip of canvas. I walked up to it. It was from a backpack, faded green with part of a zipper still attached. The edges were cut clean, like with a knife. Underneath it, stuck to the bark, was a small torn piece of paper folded in half. I opened it. There was nothing written on it, just blank, empty. Wait, that was enough. I got in the truck and started driving. The road felt longer going out, the trees thicker. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, expecting to see something, someone, anything, but nothing came. When I reached town, I stopped at the gas station and called my friend. I told him I was done with the cabin and thanked him again, but I didn't explain why. I didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, in the hotel, I laid in bed thinking, whoever was out there hadn't hurt me, hadn't stolen anything. They had just watched, followed, entered quietly, left a strip of fabric. A blank note. They wanted me to know they were there, that they had the chance to do something but didn't. That's what stayed with me. That feeling never left. Years later, I still think about it sometimes. Not the cabin, not the cold, not the woods, just those boot prints in the mud, circling the place I thought I was safe in. That quiet walk around my shelter, that unspoken message, and the silence behind it all. My name's Jeremy Blake, and this happened in the fall of 2017. I was 34 then, working as a heavy equipment operator in southern Missouri, not far from the Arkansas border. I had just gone through a messy split with my longtime girlfriend, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. Too many memories in town, too many people asking questions I didn't want to answer. So I decided to get out for a weekend, go off-grid, get some quiet. My uncle had this old cabin deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, a place that hadn't been used much since he passed in 2009. It was a simple one-room place. No running water, no electricity, just 4 walls and a roof with a wood stove in the corner. My dad and I used to go up there to hunt when I was a teenager, and I remembered it being peaceful. Still had to hike in about 2 miles from the nearest place you could park a truck, so it wasn't the kind of place you went unless you really wanted to disappear. I packed up my gear that Friday morning. Sleeping bag, food, tools, my Glock, and a pump-action shotgun, and drove out in my old F-150. It was late October. The leaves were turning orange and red. Weather had been dry all month, and the dirt roads were dusty, which made the truck fishtail a bit. I got to the forest trail around noon. The parking spot was just a wide shoulder off a logging road. No signs or markers. I threw my backpack over my shoulder, locked the truck, and started hiking in. Felt good to move, to get away from everything. The trail wasn't much more than a game path now, overgrown and hard to follow in spots. Nobody had been maintaining it. I had to step over fallen branches, duck under leaning trees, and bushwhack a few times. Took me about 45 minutes to reach the cabin. It looked just how I remembered it. Maybe a little more weathered. Roof was still intact, door still on its hinges. The windows had no glass, just old wooden shutters, but they were closed. I walked the perimeter, checked for signs of animals or squatters. Didn't see anything but a few raccoon tracks and some deer scat out back. I unlocked the padlock with the old key my dad had kept in a coffee can in the garage and pushed the door open. The inside smelled like dry pine and dust. Everything was still in place: 2 cots, a wood-burning stove, a small table with a few beat-up metal chairs. The shelves along the back wall still had some old camping supplies: rusty lanterns, cans of beans, a pack of cards warped from moisture. I swept out the leaves and mouse droppings, then laid out my sleeping bag on the cot closest to the stove. After getting settled, I spent the afternoon stacking firewood, refilling the water bucket from the stream down the hill, and setting up a simple perimeter. Just some fishing line and empty cans, an old trick my uncle taught me to hear if anything moved around the place at night. Around dusk, I made a small fire in the pit out front and cooked up a can of chili. The woods were quiet.
No birds.
No wind, just the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of dry leaves falling. I sat out there until the stars came out. It was colder than I expected, probably high 30s. I layered up, locked the shutters from the inside, fed the stove some kindling, and climbed into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep easy, but I figured that was just me not being used to the silence. No traffic noise, no hum of power lines, just absolute stillness. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not sure what did it. Maybe the cold, maybe just instinct. The fire in the stove had gone low, barely glowing. I sat up and listened. I didn't hear anything at first. Then something snapped out in the woods. A branch, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I stayed still, breathing slow. Could have been a deer, could have been a coyote. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. It was the sound of one of my perimeter cans rattling. Something had tripped the fishing line. I got out of my bag slowly, careful not to knock over the folding chair near the cot. I slipped on my boots, grabbed the shotgun, and stood just inside the door. I didn't open it. I just listened. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't moving fast. No crashing, no running. Just slow, careful steps on the dry leaves. Crunch. Wait, crunch. I kept my finger off the trigger but stayed ready. I waited like that for maybe 10 minutes and then nothing. The sounds just stopped.
No retreat. No snapping branch.
Just silence again. I waited longer, maybe half an hour, and eventually climbed back into my bag. But I didn't sleep. Next morning, I walked the perimeter. Found one of the fishing lines snapped. The can had been dragged a few feet like it got caught on something. But there were no boot prints, just disturbed leaves. No claw marks either. Could have been an animal. Could have been wind. But it didn't feel right. Still, I shook it off. Didn't want to let my nerves get the better of me. I spent the day hiking a nearby ridge, came back in the afternoon, cooked some beans and rice, and cleaned my shotgun just to pass the time. Sun went down fast behind the trees. It got dark early. That night was colder. I added more wood to the stove before lying down, this time keeping the shotgun on the cot with me. Slept with my boots on. Didn't think I'd need to, but I did. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slower this time. Closer. Then I heard it, the door latch. Jiggled. Just once. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in. Just a test. Like they were checking if it was locked. I sat up fast and aimed the shotgun at the door. I didn't make a sound. Didn't breathe. My heart was thumping so loud I thought they could hear it from the other side. Then came the softest knock I've ever heard. Just one. Then nothing. I waited there for what felt like hours. I didn't move. I didn't go outside. And eventually, I must have nodded off, because next thing I knew, the sun was coming up. When I stepped out, I checked the door. There were faint smudges on the handle. Not handprints, just oily streaks. I checked the trail around the cabin, but again, no clear footprints. Whatever they were wearing, it didn't leave an impression. I should have left then, should have packed up and gone home. But some stupid part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared, that I wasn't just seeing things or imagining it, that maybe I was just being paranoid. So I stayed a third night. I made a bigger fire that night and stayed out beside it for a long time. I had the shotgun across my lap, just staring into the dark woods. There was no moon, just stars and shadows. And then I saw it, a figure, standing between two trees maybe 50 feet away. Not moving, just standing there.
No flashlight.
No glow of a phone. Nothing. Just a solid black shape in the darker black of the woods. I didn't say anything, just slowly stood up, shotgun ready, and stared back. But the shape didn't move. After what felt like 10 minutes, it turned. Walked away, slow and quiet. I didn't follow. I went inside, locked everything, sat against the door with the shotgun aimed at the floor. I didn't sleep that night at all. Next morning, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't boil water, didn't even bother folding my gear. I just shoved it into my pack and got out. The trail back to my truck felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept stopping, turning around, listening. At one point, I found a mark carved into a tree. A simple X, fresh, bark still raw. It hadn't been there before. When I reached my truck, I noticed something else. There was a small pile of rocks stacked on the hood. 6 or 7 stones balanced carefully. That wasn't there when I left it. I knocked them off, unlocked the door, and drove off without looking back. I didn't tell anyone. Not my dad. Not my coworkers. I kept it to myself. But 2 weeks later, I heard something that froze my blood. There'd been a man found dead in a cabin about 20 miles west of where I'd been. Similar setup, off-grid, remote, deep in the forest. Cause of death wasn't released, but the report said there were signs of someone else being there. No forced entry.
No struggle.
They never found out who did it. That was the last time I went back to any cabin in the woods. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear that soft knock on the door. And now I always check the locks, every single night. I was 32 when this happened. At that time, I was working at a small logistics company based out of Columbia, Missouri. It wasn't some huge place with a lot of departments and employees. It was a 10-person crew that handled deliveries and fleet management for local retailers and a couple of agricultural supply stores out of state. My boss, Richard, was one of those older guys who talked slow, wore the same beige shirt every day, and could tell you anything you needed to know about tires or brake rotors. He wasn't the kind of guy you hung out with. We all respected him because he didn't micromanage and let us go home on time. One day in early October 2022, Richard walked into the break room while I was eating a peanut butter sandwich, sat down, and asked if anyone liked fishing. I half raised my hand, mostly to be polite. I didn't fish much anymore, but when I was younger, I'd go with my uncle out near Lake of the Ozarks. That was enough for Richard. He said his grandma's old cabin out in the woods near Montauk State Park was sitting empty, and he'd planned a weekend up there to fish, check on the place, and split some wood. His back was acting up, and he asked if I wanted to tag along and help. He said I could stay there free, eat whatever I brought, and fish as much as I wanted. It sounded good enough. I had no plans that weekend. I figured it'd be quiet, and I liked the idea of staying in an old cabin for a few days. My rent was due the next week, and I could use a break from my noisy apartment building. I said sure. We drove up early Friday morning in his old Ford truck. The road took us out of town past patchy farmlands, past areas where cell phone signal vanished and everything started to feel quieter. The air smelled like damp leaves, and the sun was still rising when we got to the gate that led to the property. It wasn't a proper gate, just a sagging metal cattle panel held shut by a chain and a rock. Richard kicked it open and drove through. The cabin was old. Built in the 1960s, he said. His grandma had lived in it alone for decades before she moved to a nursing home a few years back. She died in 2020, but the cabin hadn't been touched much since then. It sat tucked into a thicket of trees, maybe half a mile off the main gravel road, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. A narrow, uneven dirt driveway led to it, the kind that looked like it washed out every spring. The place was simple, dark wood exterior, single porch light, a chimney that looked like it had been patched up a few times. We unloaded the truck. Richard brought gear for fishing and an old steel chainsaw to cut firewood. I carried the cooler and a bag of canned food I brought, beans, chili, tuna, stuff like that. He stayed for an hour or two, showed me how to work the water pump and light the propane stove, then said he'd be back Sunday afternoon. He left me with a two-way radio and drove off down the trail. I stood there for a minute after his truck disappeared, listening to how still everything got. No road noise, no people, just birds and the wind. The first few hours were easy. I walked around the cabin, checked out the old shed out back. It was full of rusted tools and broken chairs. I gathered kindling, chopped a little firewood, and sat on the porch for a long time, watching the trees sway. The sun dipped lower, and a breeze picked up. That night, I lit a small fire in the wood stove, cracked a beer, and ate chili out of the can with a spoon. Felt nice, quiet, peaceful. But the peace didn't last long. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. The outhouse was a short walk from the cabin, maybe 40 feet into the trees. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped outside. It was cold and quiet. I could hear my own breath. While I was out there, I heard something behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, just a soft snap like a twig breaking under a foot. I stood still, flashlight off, and listened. Another soft snap. I waited. Nothing else. I walked back to the cabin slowly, shining the light around. Nothing moved. No animals. No people. I figured maybe it was a deer. There were plenty of them around, and Richard said they sometimes came up close at night. The next day, I spent most of the morning hiking along the creek nearby. I didn't catch any fish, but I saw deer prints in the soft mud and a half-collapsed tree stand farther off the trail. It looked like no one had used it in years. That night, just after midnight, I heard something again. Came from behind the cabin. This time, it wasn't just twigs. It sounded like someone stepping hard on the porch planks. Not fast, not sneaky, just footsteps. 2 or 3, then silence. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The wood stove was still burning, casting a soft orange light. I hadn't locked the door, which made me angry at myself. I crept to the front and slowly turned the latch. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to look out the window either, but I did. Nothing. No one was on the porch. I turned on the outside light, but the bulb just flickered and buzzed without turning on fully. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside in just socks and a hoodie. I stood there, freezing, scanning the woods. Still nothing, but something was off. I walked around to the back where I thought the sound came from. The shed door was open now. I was sure I had latched it shut earlier. Inside, it looked the same. No one there, no footprints I could see, but one of the rusted shovels had fallen to the floor. I picked it up and leaned it back against the wall. I closed the shed again and jammed a stick through the latch. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. Just sat by the stove, trying to read an old Field and Stream magazine I found on the shelf. By morning, I was tense. I walked the property line with my flashlight and a hammer in my coat pocket. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I saw tracks along the edge of the woods. Not clear ones, just faint impressions like someone wearing boots had walked the tree line, stopped, turned around. I went to check the cabin again. The back window, the one above the old pantry, had fresh scratches on the wood. Not claw marks, just scrapes like someone had tried to open it. I checked the lock, still secure, but my nerves were getting shot. I figured maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe some kid from a nearby farm screwing around. But this place was remote, no other houses for miles. That evening, I didn't go outside. I brought in firewood, locked all the doors, and stayed near the stove. I didn't cook, just ate crackers and jerky and watched the door like a guard dog. I was exhausted, but I didn't let myself sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time closer. They were on the roof. I froze. Slow, steady steps above me, creaking, shifting, like someone walking across the metal roof right above the bedroom. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited, hand gripping the hammer in my pocket. The steps stopped. Then I heard a scraping sound, like a shoe or boot dragging across the metal. I wanted to run, but where? Into the dark woods? I didn't know what time it stopped. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour later. But it stopped, and I didn't hear anything else after that. At dawn, I finally stepped outside. No one was around. The forest was dead quiet. I looked up at the roof. Nothing there. But when I walked to the side of the cabin and looked up, I saw clear marks where the metal was scuffed. Someone had been up there, maybe watching. I packed my stuff. I didn't care if Richard was coming back Sunday. I was done. I didn't tell him what happened. When he arrived later that day, I was sitting by the road with my bag already packed. He asked if I had a good time. I said, yeah, it was peaceful. He laughed and said his grandma used to think the place was cursed. I just smiled and nodded. I didn't tell him about the steps, or the shed, or the roof. A month later, someone broke into that cabin. Richard mentioned it at work, said some local cops found the place trashed. Food gone, furniture messed up, scratches all over the walls. He blamed meth heads. I didn't say anything. I never went back. And to this day, I don't go camping alone anymore, because I still don't know who or what was out there. But I know they were real. I heard them, and I think they knew I was alone. It was early July of 2018 when I decided to return to the Amazon. I was 34 then, working freelance jobs that let me move around a lot, and I had just finished a photography project in northern Argentina. I had been feeling restless, burned out. I hadn't been to the Amazon in over 10 years, not since that one research trip during university. Back then, I was studying environmental science. We were part of a study documenting disappearing bird species and how illegal logging affected the ecosystem. But it wasn't the research that stayed with me from that trip. It was the place. The cabin we stayed in back then had been way deeper into the jungle than any tourist would go. It wasn't even really a cabin in the proper sense, just a rough wooden structure built up on stilts, with gaps in the planks wide enough to see through. It had a metal roof, a rainwater tank, and no electricity. Just oil lamps, some worn-out cots, and a sense of complete isolation. I had been thinking about that cabin a lot lately, about how quiet it was out there, about how alive everything felt. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe I just wanted to disappear for a while and be off the grid. I still had GPS maps saved from the last time. I knew I could reach that same general area if I took a flight to Manaus and hired the right people to drop me upriver. I figured I could spend a couple weeks alone, camping, clearing my head, maybe take some photos and live off canned food and fish. So I went. I flew into Manaus on July 3rd. The city had changed. Taller buildings, more crowded roads. But I wasn't planning to stay long. I met a guy named Felipe through a contact from an old travel blog. He had a long wooden boat with an outboard motor and agreed to take me upriver for a few hundred reis. He didn't ask questions, just looked at me like I was crazy for wanting to be left that far out alone. I gave him my satellite beacon in case something went wrong, just so he could track the spot where he dropped me. That was our deal. Drop me upriver. Come back in 2 weeks. The trip upriver took the better part of a day. The river was wide, the water dark and moving slow. We passed small villages, kids swimming in the shallows, dogs running on the shore. But after several hours, the houses thinned out, and soon it was just thick green jungle rising up on both sides. The kind of place where you couldn't hear cars or planes. Just birds, insects, the occasional splash of something moving below the surface. We reached the point where I told him to stop. It wasn't the exact location of the old cabin, but it was close, maybe a few kilometers off. I had marked it on my offline GPS. I stepped off onto the muddy bank, and he turned around and motored off without a word. I stood there for a while, just listening to the jungle. I could feel the heat sitting heavy on my skin. I adjusted my pack and machete and started moving inland, following the GPS coordinates. It took a couple hours of slow, careful hiking. Everything was wet and slick with mud. Vines hung low, and there were swarms of mosquitoes that wouldn't stop. I kept moving, using the sun as a rough guide when I lost the GPS signal under the canopy. Eventually, I saw something through the trees. Not exactly the cabin, but the remains of it. It had been over a decade, and time had done its work. One of the walls had collapsed. The floorboards were warped and half covered in vines. The roof was still mostly intact, and the stilts had kept the place above water during rainy seasons. I cleared away some of the plants and set up camp nearby, planning to sleep inside the structure. It still had enough cover to keep me dry. The first few days were peaceful. I set up a hammock in the cabin, cooked rice and beans over a small stove, collected rainwater and filtered it, took a few photos of the area, mostly insects and the dense plant life. I didn't see anyone or hear anything that made me nervous, just the constant hum of the forest. But around day 5, something changed. I was walking a short distance from the cabin, looking for a good spot to fish along the edge of a narrow creek, when I noticed something strange in the mud. A footprint. Not mine. Not a shoe either. It was bare, long, and thin. It looked fresh. I crouched down and looked closer. Whoever made it had passed through less than an hour earlier. The edges hadn't yet filled with water. I stopped moving, just listened. Nothing but insects. Could have been a local, some hunter or someone foraging. But we were hours from any village. And why would someone come this far without shoes? That evening, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard rustling outside, branches breaking, a splash somewhere out in the dark. I stayed inside the cabin, machete close, listening for any sound that felt out of place. By morning, nothing had happened. I told myself I was overthinking it. That afternoon, I went back toward the creek to see if there were more tracks. There weren't. But when I got back to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The food bag I kept hanging from the ceiling, way up to keep it away from insects and rodents. It was missing. Not torn or broken, just gone. I looked around the area. No signs of animals. No wrappers on the ground. Nothing. Someone had come into the cabin, climbed up, and taken the food without making a mess. That's when the dread started to sink in. That night, I didn't cook. I stayed completely silent. I turned off my headlamp and sat still in the dark for hours. The jungle is always alive at night, full of movement. But that night, there were long periods of complete silence. The kind of silence that only happens when something big is moving nearby and everything else goes still. At one point, just past midnight, I thought I saw movement outside the cabin, just a shadow between trees. No light, no sound. I stayed frozen. Nothing happened. The next morning, I made a decision. I'd stay one more night, then hike toward the river and camp closer to the pickup spot. I had enough photos. I didn't feel safe anymore. I had a few protein bars left and a small backup ration, enough to hold me over. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, packing slowly, checking my surroundings every few minutes. That evening, before sunset, I saw someone. He was maybe 60 feet away. Thin, shirtless, skin dark from the sun, with hair matted and long. He wasn't carrying anything.
No bag, no weapon.
Just standing there between the trees, half hidden behind a wide trunk, looking directly at me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. After a long minute, he turned and walked away, silently, deeper into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I packed everything, tied my hammock up, and waited for dawn. I didn't light any fire. I didn't use my flashlight. I just sat in the dark, with my back against the wall of the cabin, machete in hand, ears tuned to every sound. I could feel something wasn't right. At one point, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard slow footsteps in the leaves. Not an animal. They stopped right outside the cabin wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just held still. Then they walked away. By first light, I was gone. I didn't take the path I used to come in. I cut directly south toward the river, moving fast, not caring about noise. My boots were soaked. My legs were covered in bug bites. I didn't stop to eat. I just kept walking, checking behind me every few minutes. It took 6 hours to reach the riverbank. I recognized the bend in the river from the maps. It was the same place where Felipe had dropped me. I waited there all night and the next day, hungry and exhausted, until I saw his boat coming back. When he saw me, he looked surprised. I had lost weight. My face was sunburnt and dirty. I didn't explain anything. I just handed him the rest of the money and sat in the back of the boat, staring at the trees until they disappeared behind the bends of the river. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time. There was no real event. Nothing dramatic. Just signs, tracks, a stolen bag, a stranger watching me, and a feeling I still can't shake, that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it back. Not all dangers scream. Some just watch from the trees and wait. It was early October of 2019 when I finally took the trip I had been putting off for over a year. I needed a break from city noise, screens, and the predictable routine of work and traffic. I had recently moved to Kansas City for a job in logistics, but my head just hadn't caught up with everything. The stress, the burnout, and some personal stuff I'd rather not get into, all of it felt like it was pressing down on my chest every day. I needed quiet, solitude, so I rented a remote hunting cabin in the woods of northern Arkansas, just south of the Ozark National Forest, not far from Jasper. It wasn't one of those sleek rental cabins with Wi-Fi and dishwashers. This one had no power, no plumbing, just 4 wooden walls, a roof, a cast iron stove, and a narrow deck that overlooked a pine-covered ridge. I'd found it on an old forum where a guy was offering his family's unused hunting spot for cheap, as long as you didn't mind being out of reach. That's what he'd written in his post. I didn't mind. In fact, that's what I wanted. My dog Rusty came with me, of course. He's a 4-year-old red heeler mix I rescued when I was still living in Colorado. About 50 pounds, all muscle, with eyes that always look like they're trying to solve a problem. Smart as hell, loyal to a fault. He loves hikes, rivers, and rolling in dead things when I'm not paying attention. I couldn't imagine a trip like this without him. We left on a Thursday morning. The drive was about 6 hours. The last 2 were slow and bumpy, with long winding roads that climbed through thick woods. My phone lost signal about 20 minutes before I got to the turnoff. From there, It was a gravel road that narrowed until I was almost sure I was on the wrong path. But just as I started thinking I should turn around, the trees broke open and I saw the old wood cabin sitting in a small clearing with an empty fire ring out front. It looked exactly like the photos, run down but standing. A single-room structure with a metal roof, one dusty window, and a heavy wooden door. I parked the truck about 20 feet away and let Rusty out. He trotted around, sniffing everything, tail wagging. I unloaded my cooler, sleeping bag, camp stove, and 2 plastic containers of food and gear. There was a shed out back where I stored extra firewood and a backup water jug. The guy who rented it out had left a 5-gallon water container under the porch and a note carved into the wall inside. Boil before drinking. That first night was calm. The sky turned orange and then deep blue as the sun dropped behind the trees. The temperature dipped to the low 50s, perfect for sleeping. I lit a fire out front, cooked some hot dogs, and shared one with Rusty. The air was thick with the smell of pine and smoke. I hadn't felt that relaxed in months. Just me and my dog and nothing else. I fell asleep easily that night, but I woke up around 2 a.m. to Rusty growling low in his throat. He wasn't barking, just growling, deep and slow, from the foot of my sleeping bag. The moonlight coming through the window was enough for me to see his silhouette, ears up, head turned toward the door. I sat up and waited, listening. Nothing.
No footsteps.
No wind. No animal sounds. Just silence. After a minute, Rusty stopped growling but didn't lie back down. I got up, opened the door slowly, and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit me right away. I stood there barefoot for a few seconds, looking out into the trees. Still nothing, just the dark woods and moonlight flickering between branches. I went back in, gave Rusty a pat, and we both eventually drifted off again. The next morning, I figured it had been a raccoon or something nosing around. Rusty was acting normal, and the area around the cabin didn't show anything out of place. I made oatmeal and coffee, then packed up for a long day hike. There was a creek about 3 miles out with a little rock outcropping where I planned to sit for lunch. We hiked all day. Rusty ran ahead and circled back like always. I marked trees with orange tape as I went, just to make sure I didn't lose my way back. Around 4 p.m. we returned, sweaty and tired but satisfied. I split a can of chicken with Rusty, drank from my water jug, and washed up in the metal basin outside. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Rusty was on edge again. Around 1 a.m., I heard him get up and walk to the door. This time, he let out one sharp bark. I sat up fast. His tail was stiff and he was staring at the door. I grabbed the flashlight, opened the door, and stepped out. The forest was even quieter than before. I swept the beam back and forth across the trees. Still nothing. Then I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks had been stacked just at the edge of the clearing, maybe 15 feet from the cabin. I hadn't seen it the day before. It was about knee-high and oddly neat, 7 or 8 flat stones balanced in a deliberate-looking stack. I stared at it for a while, then shined the light around again, heart beating a little faster. I knew it wasn't there when we arrived. I would have noticed something like that. I stayed outside for 10 more minutes, listening. I didn't hear anything but my own breath and the slight creak of trees moving in the breeze. Finally, I went back in and slid the wooden bolt across the door. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I knocked the rock pile over and kicked the stones into the trees. Probably some weird leftover thing from hunters or hikers. I told myself, maybe a marker or trail sign. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near the cabin. I looked around the woods but saw no footprints, no broken branches. I didn't mention it in the trip log I kept on my phone, which was useless out here anyway with no signal. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I gathered firewood and cleaned out the stove, trying to keep busy. Rusty seemed more alert than usual, sniffing the air every few minutes. He kept going to the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. He didn't bark or growl, just stood there, watching. Later that night, I heard something again. I was lying on the sleeping pad with Rusty curled up next to me when I heard a thud outside. Not a branch falling, more like something stepping on the porch. Then a light scraping noise, like wood on wood. Rusty bolted up and rushed to the door, growling louder than before. I sat up, heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight again and pushed the door open fast. Nothing, just the porch and the woods. But this time I noticed something else. My boots, which I had left just beside the door on the porch, were gone. I shined the light around the edge of the cabin and spotted them about 20 feet away, half buried in the dirt, as if someone had picked them up and thrown them, or carried them and dropped them. They weren't even next to each other. I brought them back, locked the door again, and sat up for a long time. Rusty didn't lie down either. He stayed right by the door, ears up, muscles tense. Something was wrong. I made a decision that night to leave the next morning. I didn't care if the rental had 2 days left. Something about the area didn't feel right anymore. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I trusted my dog, and I trusted my gut. Something was watching us. At first light, I packed up everything and loaded it back into the truck. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. Rusty jumped in the passenger seat without me needing to call him. I took one last look at the cabin, then started the engine. But just as I began to turn around, something caught my eye. Another rock pile. This one was right behind the shed. Bigger than the last. Taller. 10 or 12 flat stones carefully stacked. That's when I realized someone had been out there. Someone was watching the cabin. Maybe even coming up to it while we were asleep. They hadn't done anything yet. But the rock piles, the boots, the silence, it all added up to something I didn't like. I drove away and didn't stop until I hit paved road an hour later. Signal came back and I got a few messages, but I ignored them. I just wanted to get home. Back in Kansas City, I didn't tell anyone the full story. Just said the trip was quiet and cut short because of the weather. But I still think about it. About who was out there. Why they didn't show themselves. Why they didn't just break in or steal something. Why they were stacking those rocks like signals or warnings. Or if it was meant to scare me off. It worked. I haven't been back to that cabin. I haven't even opened the folder on my computer with the trip notes. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night and Rusty's standing by the window, ears up, staring out into the dark, I wonder if someone followed us back.